will mark the 34th anniversary of the catastrophic Chernobyl nuclear accident in Ukraine. Now, Chernobyl is in the news again, with a multi-week fire still raging within the exclusion zone, and signs that radioactivity has again been released in the smoke and debris. In both instances, the public has been inundated with so-called experts trying to convince us that nuclear is really safe and there have been no lingering negative effects from either the initial accident or the fire. But then you hear a genuine expert, one who did her research on the ground at 27 Eastern European medical archives and has the footnotes to prove everything she says. And she tells you,
when they found catastrophic results, which was a major epidemic of children with thyroid cancer, very rare cancer among kids, 1 in a million normally get it. Suddenly in a small area of northern Ukraine, they had 20 kids, and the Soviet doctors handed the foreign experts 20 biopsies. They didn't believe that this could possibly be thyroid cancer among so many kids. They brought them home to have examined, and sure enough, they found that these were cancers. But then in their report, they said, we heard some rumors about thyroid cancer among children, and we found those rumors to be anecdotal in nature. But what they were sitting on was hard evidence, and they had other evidence of 30 more kids in Belarus. And that indeed turned out to be the tip of the iceberg of what became a big epidemic in thyroid cancer among kids.
the nuclear industry covering up facts about the negative impact of an accident at one of their facilities? Much as they try to deny that's the case, when you hear a genuine expert like Kate Brown say something like that, and so much more, you get a pretty clear picture of the Chernobyl nuclear cover-up, which wants us to not know that we are all sitting in a single seat, a seat that the entire world shares.
Nuclear hot seat, what are those people thinking? Nuclear hot seat, what have those boys been drinking? Nuclear hot seat, the corium is sinking. Our time to act is shrinking, but our activists are linking. Nuclear hot seat, it's the bomb.
Welcome to Nuclear Hot Seat, the weekly international news magazine keeping you up to date on all things nuclear from a different perspective. My name is Libby Halevi. I am the producer and host, as well as a survivor of the nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island from just 1 mile away. So I know what can happen when those nuclear so-called experts get it wrong. This week, 2 terrific interviews. First up, a blockbuster talk with Kate Brown, author of Manual for Survival, A Chernobyl Guide to the Future. It's a brilliantly researched, stunning story of the hidden impact of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster on people and the environment. We will also hear from evolutionary biologist Timothy Mousseau, whose groundbreaking work on the ground in Chernobyl has been tracing the changes in insects, birds, and now mammals down to their genetic level. If you think radioactivity isn't doing much of anything to our ability to sustain and perpetuate life on this planet, what Tim Mousseau has to say will make you think again. Plus, our Covid-19 nuclear update and more honest nuclear information than Dan Rather has yet featured on his News and Guts website. All of it coming up in just a few moments. Today is Tuesday, April 21st, 2020, and here is this week's nuclear news from a different perspective. Starting off with an update on Chernobyl, which not only faces its 34th anniversary this week, but is also still on fire. The blaze started on April 4th and continued through to the 14th when rain knocked it down. And as of last week's program, we thought that it was out. However, the flames revived as of the 15th and 16th and have continued to burn through the exclusion zone. The fire has burned more than 30,000 hectares, which is the equivalent of 116 square miles. Photos of on-site radiation meters showed radiation levels up to 16 times higher than is normal in the area. This comes from a re-release of radioactive materials that have been harbored in dead wood and in the leaf and other duff of the forest. According to researchers Timothy Mousseau and Andrews Moeller, the decomposition of humus and dead wood is slowed down in contaminated areas, allowing greater amounts of dry wood to accumulate. This phenomenon could be attributed to the vulnerability of insects and microorganisms to radioactivity. Resuspension of radioactive substances in the atmosphere includes cesium-137 and probably plutonium and strontium-90. According to data released by the independent laboratory of CRERAD, the Commission for Independent Research and Information on Radioactivity, this fire has caused 700 times the concentration of cesium-137 in the air of the city of Kiev, located more than 100 kilometers or 60 miles south of the Chernobyl power plant remains. Kiev, which is already on lockdown for coronavirus, registered the worst air quality in the world this week. And in Finnmark, which is far to the north in Norway, higher than normal levels of cesium-137 were measured, and while the origin of these elevated radionuclides is officially unknown, it is believed that winds from the Chernobyl area could have pushed the radioactive smoke to the Finnmark region. At the Vogel nuclear construction site in Georgia, as of April 17, which is the most recent data we can find, 64 workers have tested positive for COVID-19 out of just under 300 who have been tested. Vogel has, in response, cut 2,000 workers from its force and instructed them to stay home. But that is out of a workforce of 9,000. Georgia Power claims to remain focused on protecting the safety and health of its workers at Vogel 3 and 4, but construction work continues. Refueling of U.S. nuclear reactors also continues, but the Nuclear Regulatory Commission blackout on reporting instances of COVID-19 positives and sicknesses on site limits our ability to be specific about the impact. Especially troubling is lack of further information from inside the Limerick nuclear power plant near Philadelphia, where 2 weeks ago, whistleblowers reported that the workforce was, quote-unquote, terrified at the impossibility of social distancing with new workers coming in. Know that in each refueling of a nuclear reactor, it takes approximately 4 weeks, with an increased outside population of 800 to 1,600 workers necessary on site, all of whom are possible disease vectors. In the UK, there have been numerous calls to temporarily halt construction on the new Hinkley Point C reactors. Roy Pumphrey, a spokesman for the environmental group Stop Hinkley, wrote to the acting Prime Minister, EDF, the contractors in charge of the construction work, cannot confine to barracks workers in its hostels, themselves a potential breeding ground for COVID-19. So when workers venture out, there is a much greater risk of spreading COVID-19 than if they were on furlough and staying at home. And the UK and Ireland nuclear-free local authorities, in a written statement, said NGOs and our organization are aware that construction at the comparable Flaman 3 new nuclear plant in France has been reduced to control and maintenance levels only. The same should happen for Hinkley Point C. At the Hanford site in Washington State, as of April 16, the first coronavirus case was reported. Thousands of workers were ordered to stay home, but there are still between 1,000 and 1,700 workers still on site. In North Carolina, concerns have been raised about radioactive waste storage at the Harris nuclear plant because potential staffing shortages may increase risks of a mishap or affect the readiness to react in an emergency. Regarding last week's nuclear hot seat interview on the uranium mining stimulus money grab at Grand Canyon, leaders of Navajo Nation have joined with 75 conservation and grassroots groups asking for congressional leaders to reject any bailout for the uranium industry, an industry that has wreaked so much destruction, and they call into question the uranium company's claims that the COVID-19 public health crisis justifies extending a lifeline to a declining industry. This week's numbnuts is that the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission is facing protests after proposing that low-level radioactive waste be disposed of in commercial landfills, not explicitly designed to hold it, rather than at licensed radioactive waste sites. And in Japan on April 20th, a powerful 6.4 earthquake rocked the Fukushima area, followed by a 4.5 aftershock. We'll have this week's featured interviews in just a moment, but first, Chernobyl and its sudden flare-up of danger from wildfires, and this during its anniversary month no less, took this show's lead this week. But it's about the only thing that could supersede Nuclear Hot Seat's front and center coverage of the ever-evolving Covid-19 nuclear dangers. In truth, none of our shared nuclear nightmares ever goes away. Chernobyl, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, Church Rock, Hanford, nuclear weapons, uranium mining, endless forever radioactive waste. It's a mess, and it will not go away. And because the radioactivity that results from all of it is invisible and not understood as to its dangers, it's easy for the world to go, nuclear? Meh, I have other things to worry about, and turn away, which is a big mistake. That's why you need Nuclear Hot Seat. We look at the nuclear aspect of our world every week, and especially now, with the COVID-19 impact on worker safety, reactor safety, and the nuclear industry's manipulations and tricks during this time of fear and confusion. This program is the one place you can count on to continue to report on the ongoing, evolving nuclear truth about the COVID nuclear connection, while not dropping the ball on all the other nuclear stories. And to keep the show going, now more than ever, we need your help. So help us get the word out by providing a donation. Just go to nuclearhotseat.com and click on the big red donate button to help with a donation of any size. The big green button helps you easily set up a monthly $5 donation. So please, do what you can now. And know that however much you can help, I am deeply grateful that you're listening and that you care. Now, here are this week's featured interviews on the Chernobyl nuclear disaster on its 34th anniversary. Nuclear disasters seem to come in clusters, and we're just about to conclude this year's anniversary of Alley of what are, to date, the nuclear power industry's greatest hits. Fukushima, which happened on March 11th, 3 Mile Island, which was on March 28th, and now this Sunday, Chernobyl on April 26th. So we have 2 interviews this week to focus on Chernobyl's deadly legacy. The first is with Kate Brown. She is the author of Manual for Survival, a Chernobyl Guide to the Future. Kate is an historian of environmental and nuclear history at MIT and the author of Plutopia, which won 7 major awards. Her research has been funded by the American Academy in Berlin and by Carnegie and Guggenheim fellowships, and she put their support to brilliant use. I spoke with Kate Brown on Monday, April 15, 2019.
Kate Brown, I am so thrilled to have you here today on Nuclear Hot Seat.
It's great to be here, Libby. Thanks for inviting me.
Figuring out the truth about Chernobyl was an enormous, complex, mind-boggling project. What drew you to this area of research in the first place, and how did you get started?
Originally, I was interested in the nuclear security state, and so I wrote a book called Plutopia about the first 2 cities in the world to produce plutonium. And while I was working that story, I wasn't interested in health or environment, but these farmers who lived downwind and downriver from these 2 plutonium plants, the Soviet and American one, were telling me about their health problems. And they sounded very similar, strange health problems, and similar across this huge divide between the Siberian Soviet site and the Eastern Washington American site. And so I started working to try to figure out what that meant, if they were right, what scientists thought. And I got a little bit into that story in that book, Plutopia, but I felt like I didn't really get the story. So this is almost a sequel. And I thought, well, Chernobyl was a civilian site. It wasn't a military site, so it was more open. It exposed far more people, and it was later. It was in the 1980s rather than the the 40s and 50s and 60s. So I went into the archives and found this sort of Klondike of health records. In many points, I was the first one to check out these records. It was pretty amazing. They went, right after the accident, they went in and they took measurements. They measured air and water and soils, but they also measured people's bodies and food. And we don't really have many records like that, even though, in the 20th century history, we've had a lot of nuclear episodes and a lot of nuclear spills and intentional emissions, but we haven't had too many people curious about what happens next when all this radioactivity goes into the environment. So the Soviets did that, and they kept pretty good records, in the 5 years after the accident. Those records, I'm arguing in my book, Manual for Survival, are pretty unique.
They are, because it seems like that 5-year period of time is what gets ignored primarily. It happened after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It took 5 years before that longevity study was put into place. And no attempt was made after 3 Mile Island as well. And of course, there's been no real long-term study after Fukushima, though that's just getting started. From your perspective, why was this data not used to put forth the truth about what was happening as a result of Chernobyl, meaning the health impact of the radiation on people?
At first, it was a censored topic. So the Soviets, set out these rules. They said, we don't want anyone talking about levels of radioactivity, health problems. They had a whole list of sort of no-go areas for Soviet employees and people in hospitals and who were dealing with cleanup of the accident. And then that story broke into the press around 1989, 1990. And the leaders of Belarus and Ukraine, which had the were most impacted by the accident, came forward and said, we can't handle this problem anymore. We need help. And they appealed to the UN for help internationally. And that got the leaders in Moscow really nervous. They had been saying all along, this isn't really a problem. The doses aren't that high. Everybody can just, stay the course. And increasingly, I see in the classified records that the leaders, especially the people in the public health field in Ukraine and Belarus, were getting increasingly nervous. And more researchers were coming forward saying, we see here a big problem. I mean, by 1990, a KGB general who was a medical doctor who ran a clinic in Kiev, and he had 2,000 patients who had been exposed to Chernobyl. And he writes and he says, nobody's got a study like mine. I have the best equipped hospital. I have doctors who can actually know how much exposure their patients got. And after our 4 years of study, we have found that perfectly healthy people, when exposed chronically to low doses of radiation, have a whole host of health problems. And he lists and he recommended, this is a KGB general, he recommended that the zone of alienation, the area that should be depopulated, be extended from 30 kilometers to 120. And that would have gone right up to the beautiful ancient city of Kiev where he lived. That's how alarmed he was. So why didn't this story come into the public? The Soviet Union fell apart. It was starting to fall apart in 90. It collapsed completely in 1991. And the Soviet leaders, to try to stave off this problem, asked first the World Health Organization to come in and do an independent assessment with foreign experts. World Health sent in 3 guys. They traveled around for about 10 days. They came out and they said, we don't see any problems. We think you could double or triple the permissible dose and everybody would be fine. No one believed that study. What can 3 guys do in 10 days? So then the Soviet leaders asked the International Atomic Energy Agency to come in, and they brought in more scientists, between 100 and 200 scientists. They worked for about 18 months. They looked at levels of radioactivity. They had a medical section that looked at about 1,200 people, very small study when you consider that 4.5 million were exposed. And they came away and said, we did this study. We see a lot of illness in this area, but nothing from exposure to Chernobyl contaminants, and we don't expect to see any detectable health problems in the future other than a few cases of childhood thyroid cancer. What they weren't saying is that they designed a study for the study to find only catastrophic results. And when they found catastrophic results, which was a major epidemic of children with thyroid cancer, very rare cancer among kids, 1 in a million normally get it. Suddenly in a small area of northern Ukraine, they had 20 kids, and the Soviet doctors handed the foreign experts 20 biopsies. They didn't believe that this could possibly be thyroid cancer among so many kids. They brought them home to have examined, and sure enough, they found that these were cancers. But then in their report, they said, we heard some rumors about thyroid cancer among children, and we found those rumors to be anecdotal in nature. But what they were sitting on was, hard evidence, and they had other evidence of 30 more kids in Belarus. And that indeed turned out to be the tip of the iceberg of what became a big epidemic in thyroid cancer among kids. Now, what that report did, that report that said no effects, we don't expect to find any effects in the future, right at that time, the UN was trying to raise $1 billion in today's fund to do two things: carry out a long-term medical study akin to the study of Japanese bomb survivors, but of Chernobyl survivors. And this is a very different kind of nuclear event. Hiroshima was counted as one big X-ray that lasted less than a second. Chernobyl exposures were long-term chronic exposures of low doses. And those exposures are actually far more common. And going forward in the future, humans are far more likely to have a Chernobyl set of exposures and a Hiroshima bomb set of exposures. So all kinds of scientists said we need to do a long-term study. And then the second thing this money was going to be for was to move 200,000 people who were sitting in highly contaminated land. But after that UN report came out that said we don't see any Chernobyl health effects and we don't expect to in the future, that pledge drive went nowhere. They raised less than $6 million.
Why do you think the IAEA and before that, the scientists who came in were all minimizing the impact of Chernobyl?
Well, all I could think of is that at the same time in the 1990s, the big nuclear powers, US, UK, France, and Russia, were facing lawsuits from their own exposure, their own testing and production of nuclear weapons during the Cold War. The French had blown up nuclear weapons in Algeria and in the South Pacific. The British had blown up weapons in the South Pacific and in Australia. The Americans in the Marshall Islands and in the American heartland in Nevada. And the Soviets in Kazakhstan and in the Arctic. And so all kinds of people who had, whether they were atomic veterans in battlefield conditions or whether they were people who had been injected with radioactive isotopes for, experiments, or people who had lived downwind of or downriver of nuclear production facilities, or if they lived anywhere where the fallout landed, were starting to sue their governments about their exposures and what they felt were the resulting health problems. So if you could say Chernobyl was the worst nuclear disaster in human history, and only 33 to 54 people died, then you could make these lawsuits go away. And that's indeed what happened in the course of the 1990s and the early 2000s, as these lawsuits got no traction, in part because of this Chernobyl narrative.
Do you think it was a conscious decision on the part of the World Health Organization, the IAEA, UNSCEAR, and the various governments involved to minimize this for that reason, or was it a consequence of them going on another train of thought?
Like a lot of people are reporting that my book talks about a big conspiracy theory, and I don't use that word, and I don't think that's what was happening. I think that these scientists who had been working kind of in a bubble for a long time with the Hiroshima data felt that they knew exactly, what they call the Hiroshima studies, the gold standard. They felt like they had a real handle on what radiation medicine was and that what the thresholds were for exposure. And when people started talking about this public health epidemic in the Chernobyl territories, and we're not just talking about cancers. What the records show is that people started to feel pretty unwell almost right after the accident. The official tally is that 300, mostly firemen and nuclear plant operators, were hospitalized. The count that comes out of the archives is 40,000 people were hospitalized in the summer after the accident, many of whom were children. And they didn't feel well, sort of like respiratory infections, chronic sore throats, large thyroids, thyroid problems with their endocrine system, immune system disorders. Pregnant women had all kinds of complications at childbirth, increasing frequencies of birth defects and spontaneous miscarriages. And then after about 18 months, cancers kick in, leukemias, and then later thyroid cancers among children, and other kinds of cancers start to climb. And so when this story came out, I think the international community of scientists It didn't make sense to them. They had a great deal of faith in their established science, and these results that were coming in confounded them. They said, sure, there might be thyroid cancer among kids, but only after maybe 10 years, not after 3 or 4 years. And they just couldn't believe the evidence as it was presented to them. And if they were to believe it, they would have had to radically alter many of the regulations for operating nuclear power plants and running nuclear bomb factories. And we would have had to rethink, I think, pretty drastically our whole nuclear enterprise.
And of course, that was something that they wished to avoid. Now, scientists from Ukraine and Belarus noisily rejected the IAEA's dose estimates and the results of it. And they charged that the IAEA investigators overlooked hotspots of radiation, the resuspension of plutonium particles kicked up by dose, and the ingestion of radioactive particles. They said that people's doses were much higher than the IAEA estimated. What did all of these protestations by scientists from the Ukraine and Belarus lead to?
Unfortunately, it didn't go very far. This is at a time, and this is where history really plays an important role, when the Soviet Union was falling apart, and everything that was Soviet, whether it was politics or economics or science and medicine, was considered bad, retrograde, corrupt, somehow majorly flawed. And so when these doctors came forward and said this, they had been living with this situation for 5 years. They had been working closely on the ground with patients. What we find in the Chernobyl territories is that one of the charges is, well, when you look for disease, you're sure to find it. And there are all these, extra medical examinations of these people. But in fact, hospitals are running at 50-60% because the doctors were the first to leave these territories. They saw what was going on, and they wanted to get out of there with their families intact. But the people who did stay were quite committed, and they presented their evidence. They had case control studies. They had observational studies. They had all kinds of data that they presented, including biopsies, actual physical material to hand to the Western researchers. And it was just very, very easy to discredit them, to say, well, these Soviets, they don't have standardized Western protocols. They have very poor equipment. They have really sketchy knowledge. And, these guys mostly only spoke, Ukrainian or Russian. They didn't speak English. They weren't very facile. When they went to international conferences, they had trouble communicating. They had trouble presenting their works. So it was really easy to let the triumphalist democracy and capitalism have won rhetoric win out. And lots of people thought that was a quite sensible stance to take.
Much of your research was done looking at reports from small clinics and doctors who were on the ground in the area around Chernobyl and reporting honestly. And they were aided and abetted by what can be called citizen scientists, meaning people on the ground who said, wait a minute, something's wrong here. I've got to do something about it. What were some of the more remarkable steps taken by the people who were living in that zone to try and bring their information to the awareness of scientists in higher places, say from the West, who could possibly make a difference in the narrative?
One thing I was on the lookout as I worked my way through 27 archives were everyday heroes, people who, their bosses told them to shut up or not to say anything or to, sort of massage the numbers. And there were people who just refused to do that. And so there was one woman who, she was a physicist working at university in Kiev, and her husband was a civil defense guy. And so they had a Geiger counter. And they went around, they heard about the accident, and they went around just in the courtyard of their building in Kiev, and they found these really radioactive spots in different parts of the lawn. And they went and they found these little tiny grains of sand that were fiercely radioactive, and these were the hot particles that everybody's talking about. And this woman, Natalia Lizitskaya, gathered these hot particles, measured the counts of radioactivity coming from them, and as she ran her calculations, and then she would come back and measure the amount of decay, and then so she'd figure out what isotope it was by how quickly it was decaying, and she gathered all these different radioactive isotopes and figured out what the whole cocktail was coming from the plant. And very early on, she figured out that this was not, as we were told, a chemical and a steam explosion, but in fact a nuclear explosion at the plant, that nuclear power plants actually do blow up like nuclear bombs. And she wrote this whole report and sent it to her government to say, by the way, I want you to know that I've run these calculations and this is what I found out. And, mind you, she doesn't have a big institute. She doesn't have a lot of complicated machinery. She doesn't have a whole staff. She's just doing this, in her little tiny 2-bedroom apartment in Kiev with a Geiger counter. And in 2016, this institute in Sweden did, in fact, affirm what she'd been saying for 20 years, that this was a nuclear explosion. And Lizitskaya tried to get word out to the West that there were real problems and that there was much higher counts of radioactivity than the Soviets were letting on. And so in 1988, there was an international conference in Kiev. And so she disguised herself as a cleaning lady, got a bucket and a mop, and went into the conference and got into the closed conference that way by pretending she was just there to clean. And then she went up to a Western researcher, Robert Gale, and tried to give him a stack of her research that she had gathered. And Gail probably never knew this was happening because 4 KGB agents swept her up, grabbed her by each elbow, and led her out the back alley. But there are all kinds of people like that. Another guy, he could not get his leaders in Kiev to understand that even though his region had pretty low counts of radioactivity, the milk was off the charts, over permissible levels, and 3/4 of the milk was over permissible levels of radioactivity for the time. He went and he knocked on doors and he talked to people and he showed them all his records. He finally got 70 liters of milk and sent it to Kiev in a truck and said, "You check this milk and tell me what you think." And then once he had done that, actually having the physical, nutritious milk, in front of them that was indeed above permissible levels of radioactivity, they finally determined that this area should have special shipments of clean food. So there's people like that throughout the story. It's really pretty wonderful. It doesn't take many people to quietly resist or be committed to doing their job. That guy with the milk, Alexander Komov, he just wrote me the other day. He says, "I'm no hero. I was just doing my job." And I think those are wonderful stories, and these people should be recognized as heroes alongside the firemen and the miners and the nuclear plant operators that risked their lives to contain this accident.
You mentioned Dr. Robert Gale, who was an American. What larger role did he play in the Chernobyl disaster and other nuclear disasters that followed?
Well, he went there, very altruistically to try to help out. And because he had connections with Armand Hammer, the Soviets were saying no to all the capitalist countries. But Armand Hammer was a very influential person. And he appealed directly to Gorbachev, and Gorbachev said, yes, Gale can come in. And Gale had a new sort of what he thought would help the firemen overcome radiation sickness, and he wanted to try it out on them. And so he brought that along. And the Soviets were both nervous about this new untested drug. It had been tested on monkeys, but not humans, and also excited maybe it would work. And so Gale and a Soviet, Dr. Vorobyov, tried it on themselves first, and then they tried it out on the firemen. And unfortunately, it did not help the firemen. But then after that, Gale took to the podium, and he was the first person speaking from within the Soviet Union about the medical disaster as he witnessed it. And he really became the sort of spokesman or the face of not just this nuclear disaster, Chernobyl disaster, but he went on to a year later in Brazil. There was a smaller nuclear accident in Guyana, Brazil. He showed up there. He started to testify for different lawsuits about nuclear power plants and things like that. So he became a real spokesman, having started out as a cancer doctor, somebody who specialized in leukemia.
There's an enormous disparity in reports on the number of people who died as a result of the Chernobyl disaster. What I call the unholy trio of the IAEA, the World Health Organization, and UNSCEAR have an echo chamber that repeats often that there are only, and the number varies depending on the source, but approximately 54 immediate deaths in the affected area and maybe between 4,000 and 6,000 cases, depending on the source, of thyroid cancers as a result. On the other hand, we have the book Chernobyl, Consequences of the Catastrophe for People and the Environment by Yablokov, Nestorenko, and Nestorenko that concludes that as of 15 years ago, when it was published in 2004, there were just under 1 million premature deaths as a result of the radioactivity released. Why this disparity, and which, in your opinion, is closer to the truth?
Well, the disparity is because you cannot see, taste, feel, or touch radioactivity unless you get a big dose, an acute dose. The effects, the medical effects show up much later, whether it's months or years or decades. So it's very difficult to pin radioactive contaminants to a particular illness, especially when the illness is more subtle and not acute. And most of radiation medicine is focused on acute effects that amount to cancer and death. So everybody wants a death count, and the uncertainties in the death count are huge. And the way they come to those numbers are through a series of estimations and extrapolations. So the first thing to be estimated is the dose. How much do we think people got? And they do that by reconstructing the jet streams, the weather, how much rain came down, taking live measurements on the ground, and then estimating, what people were eating, where they were standing, how much time they spent outside. All of this is, relatively, there's a lot of uncertainty in these calculations. And then they extrapolate. This is what the unscare scientists would do is extrapolate that dose against what the Hiroshima survivors got. And with that, extrapolation, they'd say, so therefore we expect to see 4,000 cancers in the future or something like that. The problem with extrapolating from Hiroshima is a very different nuclear event. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, 2 bombs went off. They count the less than a second flash of radioactivity that came from the bombs dropping. They do not calculate in that equation of the Japanese bomb survivors the fallout from radioactivity. That was called at the time in the 40s residual radiation. The Americans, with General Leslie Groves as the head of the Manhattan Project, he was really nervous that the Americans had spent millions of dollars building nuclear weapons, and they were worried that nuclear weapons were going to go the way of chemical weapons, that they're going to be determined to be an illegal form of warfare because it didn't just blow up, and kill somebody right away, but it continued to kill people later on and maim and harm people. And that was considered, just like chemical weapons, unfair. So they emphasized, these people who died from the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs died from burns, just regular thermal burns that anybody could die of in conventional warfare. And they tried to emphasize this is like a conventional explosion. So they wanted to renounce that there were long-standing, that there was residual radiation, that radioactivity remained in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the Japanese were reporting this strange atomic poison that kills people who were not there in those cities when the bomb went off, but still came in later and got sick. And some of them died. Like, how did that happen? There must be something lingering. But none of that residual radiation or what we can now call fallout was considered in the dose. The other problem with the Hiroshima studies is that they began 5 years after the explosions. And so they asked people, where were you standing, in 1945 when the bomb went off? And people recalled to the best of their knowledge. And as we know from oral history that human memories are pretty dodgy, especially in traumatic situations. So they did a dose reconstruction. The Japanese scientists at the time actually took measurements. Historian Susan Lindy talks about this. They took their own measurements. They recorded pretty high levels of radioactivity. The Americans, when they came in and occupied Japan after the war, confiscated those records, and we don't know where they are to this day. So the Hiroshima records are dose reconstructions. They're estimates, they're guesses about how much of a dose people got. And then the third problem with the Hiroshima studies, or the Japanese lifespan studies as they're formally called, is that the Americans controlled these studies until the 1970s. And as I said, the Americans had a political interest in minimizing the impact of nuclear warfare, of atomic warfare.
What influence, if any, did this uncertainty and the minimization of health impact information from Chernobyl, and also what you're saying about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, have on our understanding of the medical impact at 3 Mile Island, which happened before Chernobyl, and Fukushima, which happened after Chernobyl?
In both the 3 Mile Island case and the Fukushima case, as with the Chernobyl cases, because scientists working, from the Japanese lifespan data are saying, these doses are too low. We estimate there's going to be no problems. We really don't have studies. We don't have serious studies. That we haven't put in the time and money and commitment to do a long-term epidemiological study on low doses, chronic low doses of radioactivity. And that is the scenario that going forward in the future we're most likely to experience. We're probably going to have more nuclear accidents, more nuclear spills. We encounter man-made radioactivity in the environment almost every day. And so we should know that, and we should demand that our scientific establishment and that our governments do those studies finally. And that's where I end. I mean, we see some troubling data coming out of places where people have been exposed to man-made radioactivity, but those are just correlations. What we need is to determine, causation. And to do that, we finally need to do some real studies.
Do you think it's intentional that these studies have not been done?
I cannot impugn what other people's motives or intentions are, but I think it's troubling that we haven't done them. I can say that for sure.
Do you think that the experts who deny or minimize any health harm from Chernobyl's radiation, not necessarily the bureaucrats or the politicians, but the scientists, actually believe their own denials of radiation's health impact?
Oh, I'm sure yes. I mean, they believe in their science and they really hold to their science. But I think what's amazing about radiation medicine is that really since the end of the Cold War, there have been amazing developments and discoveries in the field of biology and medicine. We've learned about microbiome. We've learned about how sensitive neurological systems are. We've learned about inter-cell communication and how sensitive they are, and epigenetic effects that can be passed down. Basically, almost acquired traits or patterns of cell communication that can be passed down from parent to offspring. And very few of those insights have translated into radiation medicine. We sort of need an update of that field.
Since the publication of your book, what has been the response in the media? And have you faced any significant pushback from World Health Organization, International Atomic Energy Agency, UNSCEAR, or any of the governments or individuals that you reference in the book?
No, I have not had pushback from those agencies. I've had some critical reviews, and that's fair enough. And sometimes there's been reviewers who are, industry scientists or somehow make their money from, sort of promoting nuclear energy. And I don't think that's entirely fair of publications to ask, sort of pro-nuclear spokespeople and scientists to review my book, because I don't think you can give an impartial review for that. But most of the reviews have been very good when they're an impartial reviewer.
Do you think that the radiological impact of Chernobyl on the health of people in Ukraine, Belarus, and really around the world will ever be determined beyond the shadow of scientific doubt?
Oh, I hope so. I hope one day we will have certain knowledge. Just like for a long time we didn't know, it was debated and fiercely fought over arsenic, lead, tobacco, DDT, X-raying fetuses in vivo. Like all of these things were debated, fiercely debated, that when scientists first discovered these problems, fiercely resisted, usually by people who stood to make money from selling products that were damaging to human health. Now we know for sure that cigarettes cause cancer. We know for sure that lead causes all kinds of developmental problems among children especially. We know that arsenic is poison. And so I think one day we'll have more certain understanding of what low doses of radioactivity does to human health.
If you were to sum up the message of your book and all the research that went into it and present that message to the world, what would you want to say?
I guess I'd want to say that Chernobyl is most often described as an accident, and I think that's wrong. That an accident implies that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And people definitely want closure when there's been a bad accident or any kind of trauma. But I think that's doing this event a disservice. What I found as I researched is that area in northern Ukraine was contaminated with radioactive fallout from nuclear testing before they even built the Chernobyl plant. The people who lived near that swamp, farmers, had 10 to 30 times more radioactive cesium in their bodies than people who lived in Minsk and Kiev. And I find that after the accident, the big Chernobyl accident in 1986, there are other smaller nuclear accidents. Another pretty big one, a pretty big explosion in 1991 at that same Chernobyl plant. I was following biologists who work in the zone in 2017, and my Geiger counter was screeching, and I asked them what's going on. They said, oh, we had a fire here about 8 months ago, and that burned the leaf litter and limbs and trees and volatilized the radioactivity that was stored there. That was another nuclear event. It was probably something that would have been rated level 5 on the IAEA ratings chart, but nobody paid attention to it. And so, I think what we need to do is think of Chernobyl as an acceleration on a timeline of radioactive emissions that have occurred since 1945 and that have sort of peppered and saturated, especially the northern hemisphere of our globe. And if we look at other statistics, those that record rates of cancer, rates of birth defects, male sperm counts, which have dropped in half in the northern hemisphere since 1945, cancer rates that have, steadily climbed, especially thyroid cancer has not stopped climbing. Childhood cancers used to be a medical rarity. They no longer are. I think that, again, that's a correlation, but I think we should get a lot more curious and ask our leaders and ask the scientific establishment to figure out what's going on. Why is there a cancer epidemic? Why are male sperm counts dropped in half since 45? And that's, I think, what I'd like readers to leave with at the end of my book.
One final thought. What, if any, steps are in place to allow you to address the United Nations with this information? And what might we do to help speed that along?
Well, I think we should ask for another pledge drive, and we should ask for countries that are, especially countries that are nuclear powers and have nuclear reactors, and certainly as lots of countries gear up for a new nuclear renaissance, we should ask to have that study done and paid for by, every country that's building nuclear power plants to contribute for that study so that we can finally know if this is a safe enterprise that we're pointing towards in the future.
Kate Brown, your book is a fabulous read. It's like a detective story or a murder mystery on a global level. It is, I think, necessary reading for anyone who really wants to understand what the issue of nuclear is all about. And I want to thank you for taking the time to be my guest this week on Nuclear Hot Seat.
Thanks a lot, Libby, for having me here.
That was Kate Brown, author of Manual for Survival, a Chernobyl Guide to the Future. If you want to understand the impact of nuclear radiation, as well as how nuclear boosters did and still do their best to cover up the actual impact of Chernobyl, this is one book you'll want to not only read, but to keep on your bookshelf as an ultimate reference tool. It's the logical companion to the Yablokov, Nestorenko, Janet Sherman book, Chernobyl, Consequences for People and the Environment, and it takes radiation discussion of Chernobyl into the 21st century. Now for our second interview with Professor Timothy Mousseau. He is an evolutionary biologist and faculty member of the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of South Carolina and has been in that position since 1991. Beginning in 1999, Professor Mousseau and his collaborators have explored the ecological, genetic, and evolutionary consequences of low-dose radiation in populations of plants, animals, insects, and people inhabiting the Chernobyl region of Ukraine and Belarus. More recently, he initiated a second research program in Fukushima, Japan. This is an excerpt from a much longer interview originally heard on Nuclear Hot Seat number 243 from February 16, 2016. What were some of your early findings from Chernobyl?
The first visit in 2000, we went out and found all of the barns, the old dairy farms that we could find in and out of the zone. We snuck inside the zone at the time. At the time, the exclusion zone wasn't really as high security as it is now, and so it was easy to sort of zip in and zip out with nobody ever catching you. And so we found a number of the old dairy farms that still had barn swallows in them, inside the zone, outside the zone, as well as in areas a fair distance away that were much cleaner, less radioactive, and started catching all the birds we could catch. And the first discovery was quite striking. Many of the birds living inside the exclusion zone or right on the border of the exclusion zone had patches of little white feathers on them. Nothing really striking, no three-headed monsters or anything like that, but these birds were extremely unusual. They were pale to begin begin with, but they also had these patches, what we've been calling partial albinos. There are other names for this phenomenon, but everybody sort of understands partial albinism when you say it. And this was much higher in the areas of high radiation. There are a few birds in the cleaner areas that show this, but very, very few relative to the hot areas. So that was sort of the first observation. We came back each year to these same farms to follow these same birds. And the beauty of barn swallows is that they'll actually come back to the same barn, the same nest, as long as they're alive once they start breeding. And so we put little bands on their legs so we could actually track their survival from one year to the next. We could see how many eggs they were laying and how well their babies were doing. And we could take a little blood from them so that we could look for genetic damage and antioxidant levels. And we figured out how to get a little sperm sample from the males so we could look at how well their reproductive materials performed. And all of this started to add up to an interesting story after a couple of years. First, we noticed that males in the more radioactive areas were showing sperm that was either deformed or not particularly active, not particularly good at doing its job. That was the first sort of clue that fertility might be an issue for these birds. Then we started to notice that many of the birds had other strange abnormalities, physical abnormalities, tumors on their heads, tumors on their feet and on their rear ends, and sometimes on their wings, just sort of abnormalities that you never see in a normal population. And so all of this kind of added up to the fact that these birds were not doing particularly well. They were living half as long as birds in clean areas. They were having fewer offspring. The male, as I said, the male fertility was lower. Recently, we've also shown that they have higher levels of cataracts in their eyes. It's just a plethora of negative consequences of the exposure to radiation. That was the beginning of all of this.
And you go back to Chernobyl still every year to do the updates on the bird population?
You know, we do. We've been tracking the barn swallows every year. And, every year we try to add a little experiment to the pot so that we learn a little bit more about what might be going on. The fact that we've been doing it for 15 years straight, this will be the 16th year for these populations, gives us a lot of statistical power for the sorts of questions we're interested in. Some years we've been putting little dosimeters on the legs of these birds for the last 4 years. And so now we have a really good idea of how big a dose they're getting as they fly around, and that's never been documented before. We keep following these birds, but in 2003, 2004, we realized that barn swallows were great, but people, had broader interests than just barn swallows. But what we realized actually was that there was this growing interest in what was going on in the Chernobyl zone. We weren't just doing it to satisfy our own curiosity at that point. We realized that other folks were interested in, and the questions that we were getting said, this is happening to the barn swallows. Is it happening to the other birds? What's happening to the insects? What's happening to the mammals? And so we started to branch out into a few other areas. We brought in other experts from other universities to collaborate with, to help us in some of the systems we had less experience with. And so now we've been working on the entire bird community. I guess 3-4 years ago, we added a group from Finland who are mammal specialists, small mammal specialists, and we've been trapping rodents in Chernobyl as well as in Fukushima, and learning an awful lot about other components of the ecosystem in the area.
Any results that you can report as yet?
One of the great things about working with, some of the best scientists, some of the most accomplished scientists from around the world on these projects is that, we're getting a lot done. We've published about 80 papers in the last 10, 11 years on Chernobyl and Fukushima, and folks can go to my website and get them all. But the latest results, we published a paper last week, actually. It came out. It was one of our first papers on the small mammals, the rodents of Chernobyl, where we document an increase in the rate of cataracts in the eyes of the females. And we published a paper on the birds of Chernobyl 2 or 3 years ago, showing again that the cataracts in the eyes were much higher levels in the more radioactive areas. Now we're seeing this also in the rodents. And so this provides substantial support for the hypothesis hypothesis that, this is the radiation that's causing this.
To create a more personal picture
if they can, they will throw out some objections to some of these ideas. They'll suggest that it's not due to the radiation, it's due to something else.
She was a 16-year-old living in Sofia, Bulgaria.
But clearly, the more results we have that run in parallel among different systems in Chernobyl, but also amongst the same systems in both Chernobyl and Fukushima, when we find the same kinds of results in both places, the only explanation that makes any sense is that it's the result of the radiation exposure. And so that's why we've invested so much into replicating most of our Chernobyl work in as much as we can in Fukushima as well over the last 5 years now.
Unfortunately, the reason for
Dr.
that is
Timothy
because the government
Mousseau.
never allowed
He is
any
an evolutionary biologist and has been a faculty member of the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of South Carolina since 1991.
What, if anything, did
Listening
you learn
to that
about
excerpt
Chernobyl
makes me
when
eager
it
to
happened?
share his
When
full
it happened,
interview with you
nobody
very
of the
soon on an
ordinary
upcoming
people knew
program.
anything about it. It was kept as a deep
This has
secret
been
as the
Nuclear Hot
communist
Seat
government
for
at that
Tuesday,
time felt
April 21st,
obligated to be
2020.
loyal to the Soviet
Material
Union
for this
powers
week's show
to
has
be,
been
and
researched
of
and
course, Soviet
compiled
Union
from
couldn't do anything wrong or
nuclear-news.net
make
to
any mistake. Therefore, there was
unrenard.wordpress.com,
nothing going
Beyond
on,
Nuclear,
and, not
the
only
international
we were
campaign to
told,
abolish
but
nuclear
when there was
weapons,
some
or
whispers in the air,
ICANN,
the Bulgarian government officially went to
miningawareness.wordpress.com,
national TV and declared that there's no problem, and we can eat spinach and lettuce and drink milk and be outside, and we actually
CarolinaPublicPress.org, PhoenixNewTimes.com, Reuters.com, TheBulletin.org, StateImpact.npr.org, ChemistryWorld.com, Children of Chernobyl Association, NASA, CRERAD, IRSN.fr,
happened, did you start hearing the whispers that something was wrong?
Forbes.com, the BarentsObserver.com,
whisper,
thebigwobble.org,
really
and the totally
until the fall of
captured
the
by the
communism
nuclear
in,
industry
1989.
fools at the Nuclear
So it's
Regulatory
3 years
Commission.
And half. Yeah.
Special thanks to
During
Hervé
that
Courtois
time,
for his translation
were
of the
people aware
French
of any
articles on the
changes, either
Chernobyl
in
fire,
food
as
or
well
in
as
health
a
or
steady
in
stream
children?
of fact-based
People
information.
observed,
Merci,
numerous
Monsieur
changes.
Renard.
The plants
Okay,
that spring
listener
all
involvement
looked
time.
burned
Here's
and,
what I want you to do.
yellow and gray and
Go to
brown.
nuclearhotseat.com, and if you haven't already, scroll to the yellow box, put in your first name, put in your email address, and we will send you every week a link to the show. Because that way, you know you'll always get it. And while you're at it, go to Facebook, to the Nuclear Hot Seat page, and
the next few summers, I actually was working in a farming community.
Follow.
And
make a comment,
I heard from local
look at the
farmers
comments that other people have made and respond to those. Let's get a conversation going, because we need more social media engagement. It helps get the word out to others online who might not have a chance to know about the program otherwise. It's algorithms and stuff. You can also find Nuclear Hot Seat on any of your favorite podcast platforms and on YouTube. Just put in Nuclear Hot Seat and bam, there it is. It comes up. With thanks to Julie Stam for all her years of posting the show that way. Now, if you have a story lead, a hot tip, or a suggestion of someone to interview, send an email to info@nuclearhotseat.com. And if you appreciate weekly verifiable news updates about nuclear issues around the world, always take a moment, go to nuclearhotseat.com, and look at ways there that you can support the show in moving forward. We will be grateful for anything you can do to help us out. This episode of Nuclear Hot Seat is copyright 2020, Libby Halevi and Hotseat Communications. All rights reserved, but fair use allowed, as long as proper attribution is provided.
But
this is Libby Halevi of Hotseat Communications, the heart of the art of communicating, reminding you that we can always come up with the date that a nuclear emergency begins, but we can never come up with the date that it's over,
so we really don't
because
know
once it
when
starts,
the peak will
it is never
How
over.
were babies affected by this?
There you go. You have just had your nuclear wake-up call. So don't go back to sleep, because we're all in the nuclear
You were talking
hot seat.
before we did the interview.
Nuclear
you
hot
mentioned
seat.
about
What
a
are
child
those
that
people
you knew who was
thinking?
born 3 days after
Nuclear
Chernobyl
hot
happened.
seat. What have those boys been drinking?
Daughter was born 3 days
Nuclear
after
hot
Chernobyl.
seat.
Even
The
that doctor who's a
corium is
medical personnel and
sinking.
very
Our
intelligent
time to
woman
act
wasn't
is
aware of what's
shrinking,
going on, so
but
she was
our
explaining to
activists
Dr.
are
Mousseau,
linking.
which is traditional for the area. And this is part of the
Nuclear
health for
hot
giving the baby
seat.
vitamins. That winter
It's
time
the
in Bulgaria is
bomb.
dark and cold, so you do need that exposure. Yes, her daughter's bones will literally melt.
Question everything. Intelligent radio for intelligent people. UCY.tv